On the morning of October 14, 1983, 13 men gathered at the Sorensen farm in Carroll County, Iowa. Bankers, loan officers, auctioneers, assessors. They came to finalize the paperwork that would end 91 years of family history. None of them would leave that property alive. By sunset, the barn that had stood since 1892 was nothing but smoke and ash. Inside, investigators would find what remained of 13 men who had made their living taking farms from families who could no longer pay. The killers were not criminals. They were not outlaws or drifters passing through. They were Anders Sorensen, 56 years old, and his 3 sons. Fourth-generation farmers, Army veterans, men who had never missed a Sunday at Bethany Lutheran Church in their entire lives. The reason for what they did? A piece of paper. A foreclosure notice dated September 29, 1983, giving the Sorensen family 30 days to vacate the land their great-grandfather had cleared with his own hands in 1892. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would later call it the single deadliest act of rural violence in Iowa history. Newspapers across America would run the story for weeks. Politicians in Washington would invoke the Sorensen name in debates about farm policy and the failures of the American banking system. But in Carroll County, among the farmers who had watched their neighbors lose everything, who had attended auction after auction, who had seen the white crosses multiply on the courthouse lawn, the reaction was something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that made law enforcement deeply uncomfortable. Because when asked about Anders Sorensen and what he had done, farmer after farmer gave the same answer. I do not agree with it, but I understand it. This is the story of the Iowa Harvest Massacre of 1983. It is the story of how the American dream turned to ash in the cornfields of the Midwest. It is the story of what happens when a system designed to help families instead destroys them. And it is the story of one man who decided that if he was going to lose everything, he would not lose it quietly. To understand what happened on that October morning, you need to understand what Iowa had become by 1983. You need to understand the numbers. 500 farms auctioned every single month. Interest rates that had climbed past 21%. Land that had been worth $2,000 an acre in 1980, now selling for $800 if it sold at all. 1 in 3 farming families facing bankruptcy. The highest rate of rural tragedy the state had ever recorded. In 1983, Iowa was not a place. It was a slow-motion disaster, and Anders Sorensen was standing directly in its path. But before we reach that October morning, before the smoke and the sirens and the questions that would never be answered, we need to go back. Back to a September evening in 1983, when Anders Sorensen sat at his kitchen table and opened an envelope from First National Bank of Carroll. Back to the moment when 91 years of history became 30 days of borrowed time. Back to the beginning of the end. What happened next would change Carroll County forever. It would force a nation to confront the human cost of policies made in distant offices by men who had never held dirt in their hands. And it would raise a question that America still cannot answer. How much can you take from a man before he decides he has nothing left to lose? If you have the courage to hear this story from beginning to end, stay with me. But I want to be clear about what you are about to witness. This is not entertainment. This is not fiction dressed up as history. This is the true account of 13 deaths, of families destroyed on both sides, of wounds that have never healed. This is the Iowa Harvest Massacre, and it begins with a piece of paper. To understand what Anders Sorensen became, you first need to understand where he came from. You need to understand Carroll County, Iowa, in the autumn of 1983. You need to feel the cold creeping into your bones at 5 in the morning. You need to smell the black earth after harvest, that rich dampness that every farmer knows like the scent of his own skin. You need to hear the silence of empty fields stretching to the horizon, broken only by the wind moving through the last standing corn. Carroll County sits in the western half of Iowa, about 90 miles northwest of Des Moines. In 1983, the population was just over 22,000 people spread across small towns with names like Glidden, Coon Rapids, Manning, and Arcadia. These were not cities. These were clusters of houses around a grain elevator, a church, a general store, and a bar where farmers gathered on Friday nights to talk about weather and prices and whether the rain would come in time. The land itself was some of the finest farming soil on earth. Deep black loam deposited over thousands of years, flat enough to work with machinery, rich enough to grow corn and soybeans that fed half the world. For a century, this land had made families wealthy. It had built churches and schools and communities where everyone knew everyone, where your neighbor would help you bring in the harvest and you would do the same for him. But by 1983, that land had become a curse. To understand why, you need to go back a few years. In the 1970s, the American government told farmers to plant from fence row to fence row. Global demand for grain was rising. The Soviet Union was buying American wheat. Prices climbed higher every year. Land that sold for $300 an acre in 1970 was worth $2,000 by 1980. Banks were practically begging farmers to borrow money. Expand your operation, they said. Buy more land, buy bigger equipment. The good times will never end. So farmers did exactly what they were told. They borrowed against the value of their land. They bought tractors that cost more than their fathers had paid for entire farms. They expanded from 200 acres to 500 to 1,000. They signed loan documents with interest rates that seemed reasonable at the time, because everyone knew the prices would keep rising. Then everything collapsed. In 1980, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation. Rates that had been 9% climbed to 15%, then 18%, then past 21%. Farmers who had borrowed money at reasonable terms suddenly found themselves paying more than double what they had expected. A loan payment that had been manageable became impossible. At the same time, President Carter imposed a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Overnight, one of the largest buyers of American grain disappeared from the market. Prices fell. Then they fell further. Corn that had sold for $3 a bushel dropped below $2. Soybeans followed. Everything followed. And then came the land. When farmers had borrowed money, they had used their land as collateral. The banks had looked at land worth $2,000 an acre and said, yes, we will loan you money against that value. But when prices collapsed and farmers could not make their payments, the banks discovered something terrible. The land was no longer worth what it had been. Nobody was buying. Prices dropped 30%, then 40%, then 50%, then 60%. In Carroll County, Iowa, land that had been worth $2,000 an acre in 1980 was worth $800 by 1983. Sometimes less. Sometimes there were no buyers at any price. This meant that farmers owed more money than their land was worth. They could not sell their way out of debt. They could not refinance because no bank would loan money against land that was losing value every month. They could not pay their loans because the crops they grew sold for less than it cost to produce them. They were trapped. The auctions began slowly at first. A farm here, a farm there. But by 1983, the pace had become relentless. 500 farms sold at auction every single month across Iowa. 500 families watching strangers bid on the machinery their grandfathers had bought, on the land their great-grandfathers had cleared. The auctioneers moved from county to county like a plague, their voices carrying across fields that had been worked by the same families for generations. In Carroll County alone, 47 farms went to auction in 1983. 47 families who had done everything right, who had followed the advice of bankers and government officials, who had worked 16-hour days and never taken a vacation, found themselves standing in their own yards, watching their lives sold to the highest bidder. The white crosses appeared that spring. Farmers began planting them on courthouse lawns across Iowa, one cross for every farm lost in that county. In some places, there were so many crosses you could not see the grass. They stood as silent testimony to what was happening, row after row of plain white wood marking the death of the family farm. But the crosses were not the worst of it. By 1983, Iowa was recording the highest rate of rural tragedy in state history. Farmers who saw no way out, who could not face losing the land their families had worked for generations, who could not bear the shame of failure, were making permanent decisions. 47 farmers every year in Iowa alone, 4 times the normal rate. And those were only the ones that were recorded. Everyone knew the real number was higher. The state set up hotlines, churches offered counseling, farm advocacy groups like Prairie Fire organized protests and tried to help families navigate the bureaucracy. But none of it was enough. The system was designed to take, and it was taking everything. In Carroll County, farmers talked about the system in hushed voices. They talked about loan officers who had encouraged them to borrow and were now foreclosing without mercy. They talked about auctioneers who showed up in nice suits and drove away in nice cars, while families stood weeping in their own driveways. They talked about assessors and lawyers and bankers who had never planted a seed in their lives, but who now controlled whether their children would inherit anything at all. There was a feeling in Carroll County in 1983 that something fundamental had broken. The rules that farmers had lived by for generations no longer applied. Work hard, and you will succeed. Pay your debts, and the bank will work with you. Take care of the land, and the land will take care of you. None of it was true anymore. The system had turned on them, and there was nowhere to appeal. Some farmers tried. They wrote letters to their congressmen. They drove tractors to Des Moines and Washington to protest. They hired lawyers and filed lawsuits. But the machinery of foreclosure ground forward regardless. The banks had their own problems. They were failing too, more bank failures in 1985 than in any year since the Great Depression. The loan officers who foreclosed on farms were often just following orders from holding companies in distant cities, men in suits who had never seen Carroll County and never would. This was the world Anders Sorensen lived in during the autumn of 1983. A world where the temperature dropped to 34 degrees at night and you could see your breath in the barn at morning chores. A world that smelled of diesel fuel and harvested corn and the particular mustiness of a farmhouse that had stood for nearly a century. A world where the sound of an auctioneer's voice had become more frightening than any storm. Anders had watched 11 of his neighbors lose their farms in the past 2 years. He had attended the auctions because that was what you did. You showed up to support people even when there was nothing you could do to help. He had seen grown men weep as strangers drove away with their tractors. He had seen women carry boxes of photographs out of houses their grandmothers had been born in. He had seen children ask questions that no parent should ever have to answer. And now the letters were coming to his mailbox. First, National Bank of Carroll, past due notices, requests for meetings. The polite language of bureaucracy that everyone knew meant only one thing: your turn is coming. Anders Sorensen was 56 years old in September of 1983. He had farmed the same 800 acres his entire adult life. He had raised 3 sons on that land. He had buried his wife's parents in the small cemetery at Bethany Lutheran Church, half a mile from the house where he had been born. And he had received a notice dated September 29, 1983, informing him that First National Bank of Carroll was initiating foreclosure proceedings on all 800 acres. He had 30 days. 30 days to find $400,000 he did not have. 30 days to save 91 years of family history. 30 days before everything his great-grandfather had built would belong to strangers. In Carroll County in the autumn of 1983, Anders Sorensen was not unique. He was not special. He was simply one more farmer caught in a disaster that nobody in power seemed willing to stop. But Anders Sorensen would become special, because Anders Sorensen was going to do something about it. Anders Sorensen stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall, though years of farm work had curved his spine slightly forward, the way it does for men who spend their lives bending over machinery and lifting things heavier than they should. His hands were the hands of a farmer, thick fingers, permanently calloused, knuckles swollen from decades of cold mornings and hard labor. There was a scar across his left palm from a combine accident in 1967, a white line that ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist. He never talked about it, but his sons knew the story. The machine had grabbed his glove and pulled his hand into the header. He had cut himself free with a pocket knife rather than lose the arm. His face was the color of old leather, weathered by 56 years of Iowa sun and Iowa wind. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes, and deeper ones bracketed his mouth. His hair had gone grey at the temples 10 years earlier, and had since spread across his entire head, though he kept it cut short, the same way his father had worn it, the same way his grandfather had worn it before that. His eyes were pale blue, the colour of winter sky, and they had a way of looking at you that made you feel he was seeing something more than what was on the surface. He spoke quietly. That was the first thing people noticed about Anders Sorensen. In a room full of farmers arguing about grain prices or weather or politics, Anders was the one who listened. When he did speak, the room went silent, because everyone knew that Anders did not waste words. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said, and if he told you something, you could take it to the bank. That phrase had a different meaning in Carroll County by 1983. Anders had been born in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse on March 7, 1927, the same bedroom where his father had been born in 1898, the same bedroom where his grandfather had died in 1931. The house itself was not large by modern standards. 2 stories, white clapboard siding, a porch that wrapped around the front and one side. The kitchen was in the back, looking out over the barn and the fields beyond. The living room had a fireplace that had not been used in 20 years because the oil furnace was more practical. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, 3 of which had been occupied by Anders and his brothers when they were young, before the brothers moved away to cities where the work was steadier and the future seemed brighter. Anders was the one who stayed. He had always known he would stay. The land was in his blood, the way it was not in his brother's blood, and everyone in the family understood this without it ever being spoken aloud. When his father passed the farm to him in 1958, it surprised no one. Anders was the farmer. Anders would always be the farmer. His father had been a hard man. Eric Sorensen Sr. had come through the Depression with scars that never healed. Anders remembered the year 1934 with a clarity that time had not dulled. He had been 7 years old. The drought had destroyed the crops. The bank had called the loans. His father had walked into the barn one November evening and had not come out. Anders was the one who found him. He never spoke of what he saw that night. Not to his mother, who lived another 30 years without ever mentioning her husband's name. Not to his brothers, who left Iowa as soon as they were old enough and never looked back. Not to his wife Kirsten, though she knew the way wives know things about their husbands that are never said aloud. And not to his sons, though the oldest, Peter, had figured it out years ago from the way his father's face changed whenever anyone mentioned the Depression. What Anders carried from that November night in 1934 was not grief. Grief fades. What he carried was a promise he had made to himself as a 7-year-old boy standing in that barn, looking at what the banks had done to his father, what the system had done to his family. It would never happen again. He would never let them take this land. He would die first. Anders met Kirsten Lindqvist at a church social in Manning in the summer of 1951. He was 24 years old, just back from Korea, still carrying shrapnel in his left leg from a Chinese artillery barrage near the Chosin Reservoir. She was 22, a schoolteacher's daughter from a Danish family that had been in Iowa almost as long as the Sorensens. She had yellow hair and a laugh that made Anders forget about the cold and the blood and the friends he had left in the frozen mountains on the other side of the world. They married in October of that year. 53 people attended the ceremony at Bethany Lutheran Church. Anders wore his army dress uniform because he did not own a suit. Kirsten wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the hem. In the photographs, which still hung in the hallway of the farmhouse, they looked impossibly young. 2 children playing at being adults, not knowing what the next 32 years would bring. The years brought 3 sons. Peter was born in 1951, 9 months after the wedding, which caused some quiet counting among the older women of the congregation, but no lasting scandal. He grew up tall like his father, quiet like his father, with the same pale blue eyes and the same way of listening more than he spoke. Peter had gone to Vietnam in 1970, had come back in 1972 with a bronze star and a 1,000-yard stare that took years to fade. He worked the farm alongside his father now, lived in a small house on the north end of the property with a wife named Sarah and 2 children, Emma and Thomas, who were the light of Anders's life. Niels came in 1955. He was the middle son, the thoughtful one, the one who read books and asked questions that Anders did not always know how to answer. Niels had gone to Iowa State for 2 years, had studied agricultural economics, had come back with ideas about crop rotation and soil management that actually worked. He lived in town, in Carroll, worked at the farm during planting and harvest, spent the rest of his time doing accounting for small businesses that could not afford a full-time bookkeeper. He was not married. He said he had not found the right woman. Anders suspected he had found her and lost her somewhere along the way, but he did not pry. A man's heart was his own business. Christian was the youngest, born in 1959, the baby of the family, though he stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds. Christian was the one who smiled the most, who laughed the loudest, who believed most deeply that everything would work out in the end. He had his mother's optimism, a quality that Anders loved and feared in equal measure. Christian still lived at home, still slept in the same bedroom where he had grown up, still ate breakfast with his parents every morning before heading out to the fields. He was 24 years old, and he had never known anything but farming. He could not imagine any other life. These were Anders Sorensen's sons. These were the men who would stand beside him in the weeks to come. These were the men who would help him do what he believed needed to be done. But we will come to that. Kirsten Sorensen was 54 years old in the autumn of 1983. 32 years of farm life had not been gentle to her, but she carried the wear with grace. Her yellow hair had faded to grey, which she wore pinned up during the day and let down at night, when she and Anders sat together on the porch, watching the sun go down over the fields. Her hands were as rough as her husband's, calloused from decades of gardening and canning and all the 1,000 small tasks that kept a farm household running. She had worked beside Anders through good years and bad years, through droughts and floods and hailstorms that destroyed entire crops in a single afternoon. She had raised 3 sons while her husband worked 18-hour days. She had kept the books, paid the bills, negotiated with suppliers when Anders was too proud to ask for extensions on payment. She knew about the letters from the bank. She had seen them in the stack of mail on the kitchen counter, had watched Anders carry them to his office without opening them in front of her. She knew what was coming. She had known for months, the way you know a storm is coming from the way the air feels and the way the animals behave. What she did not know was what her husband was planning to do about it. Every morning, Anders woke at 4:45. He had woken at 4:45 every morning for the past 40 years, since he came back from Korea and took over the farm from his aging father. His body no longer needed an alarm clock. The hour was written into his bones. He would lie still for a moment, listening to Kirsten breathe beside him, feeling the warmth of her body under the quilts that her grandmother had made 60 years ago. Then he would rise quietly and dress in the darkness. Work pants, work shirt, wool socks, boots by the back door. In winter, he added long underwear and a flannel-lined jacket. In summer, he sometimes left the shirt off until the sun got high enough to burn. Downstairs, he would start the coffee. An old percolator that had belonged to his mother, dented on one side from a fall off the counter in 1971, still working perfectly because Anders maintained everything he owned. While the coffee brewed, he would sit at the kitchen table and read the Bible. Not for long. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Just enough to center himself before the day began. Then, out to the barn. Check the equipment, check the fuel levels, check whatever needed checking that particular day. By 6 o'clock, Christian would be up and joining him. By 6:30, Peter would arrive from his house down the road. By 7, they would be in the fields or the shop or wherever the work was, doing what Sorensens had done on this land for 91 years. Lunch at noon. Kirsten always had something ready. Sandwiches and soup in winter, cold chicken and vegetables in summer. The men would eat quickly, talk about what still needed doing, then head back out. Dinner at 6. The whole family around the table when possible, which was most nights. Anders would say grace, the same grace his father had said, the same grace his grandfather had said before that. Then they would eat and talk and sometimes laugh, though the laughter had become rarer in recent months. After dinner, Anders would retire to his office. A small room off the living room, barely big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet and a chair. This was where he kept the books. This was where he paid the bills. This was where he opened the letters from the bank. By 9 o'clock, he would be in bed. By 9:15, he would be asleep. By 4:45 the next morning, he would be awake again, starting the cycle over. This had been his life for 40 years. This was the only life he knew. This was the life the bank was trying to take from him. What Anders valued most was not money. He had never cared about money beyond what was needed to keep the farm running and his family fed. He drove a 1975 Ford pickup truck with 160,000 miles on it. He wore clothes until they wore out, then patched them and wore them some more. The only new things he had bought for himself in the past decade were work boots, and only when the old ones had holes that could not be repaired. What Anders valued was the land, not as property, not as an asset to be bought and sold. The land was something else to him, something he did not have words for, something that lived in his chest where other men kept their hearts. The land was his grandfather clearing timber in 1892, working from dawn to dark for years until the fields were ready for planting. The land was his father fighting through the Depression, losing almost everything, but holding on to this one piece of ground through sheer stubbornness and will. The land was Anders himself, every day of his life since he was old enough to walk, learning its contours and its moods, learning where the water collected and where the soil was richest, learning which fields needed rest and which could be pushed for one more season. The land was his son's. Peter bringing his children out to see the calves born in spring. Niels walking the fence lines with a notebook, calculating yields and planning rotations. Christian driving the combine at harvest, the same combine Anders had driven, the same fields Anders had harvested, the same work stretching back through generations. The land was not something Anders owned. The land was something he belonged to. He was temporary. The land was forever. His job, his only job, the job that mattered more than anything else in his life, was to take care of that land and pass it on to his sons the way his father had passed it to him. And now the bank was telling him he had 30 days. On the evening of September 29, 1983, Anders Sorensen sat in his office with the foreclosure notice spread out on his desk. The language was legal and precise, and utterly without mercy. First National Bank of Carroll. Outstanding balance of $412,000. Collateral consisting of 800 acres in Carroll County. Notice of default. Notice of intent to foreclose. 30 days to cure the default or vacate the property. $412,000. He had borrowed the money in 1979. The bank had encouraged him to expand, to buy the 200 acres adjacent to his property when old Gus Halverson passed away. The land was worth twice what he paid for it, the loan officer had said. You cannot lose. Interest rates were reasonable then. Prices were high. Everyone said the good times would last forever. Now the land was worth half what he had paid. The crops he grew sold for less than it cost to produce them. The interest on his loan had climbed past 20%. Every payment he made, the principal barely moved. He was drowning, and the water was rising faster than he could bail. Anders read the notice 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, beside the photograph of his father that he had kept there for 30 years. He sat in the darkness for a long time, not moving, barely breathing, thinking. When he finally went upstairs to bed, Kirsten was still awake, though she pretended not to be. He undressed in silence, slid under the quilts beside her, and lay staring at the ceiling. Kirsten reached over and took his hand. She did not speak. She did not need to. Anders held his wife's hand in the darkness, feeling the calluses on her palm, the strength in her grip, the 32 years of life they had built together. And he began to plan. The first thing Anders did was call the bank. He waited until Monday morning, October 3rd, because banks were closed on weekends and because he needed the 2 days to think. He sat at his desk on Saturday and Sunday, going through every piece of paper he had accumulated over the past 4 years. Loan documents, payment receipts, letters from the bank, crop reports, equipment valuations. He organized them into piles, then reorganized them, searching for something he might have missed, some angle he had not considered. By Sunday evening, he knew the numbers as well as he knew the layout of his own fields. He owed $412,000. His land, at current prices, was worth maybe $320,000. His equipment, most of it purchased in the late 70s when everyone was expanding, might bring another 100,000 at auction, though probably less. His livestock was minimal. A few cattle, some hogs, nothing that would move the needle. Even if he sold everything he owned, he would still owe the bank money. On Monday morning, he dialed the number for First National Bank of Carroll at 8 o'clock exactly. A receptionist answered. He asked for Robert Whitmore, the loan officer who had signed the foreclosure notice. The receptionist asked him to hold. Music played. 3 minutes passed. Then Robert Whitmore came on the line. Whitmore was 45 years old. Anders had known him for nearly 20 years, since Whitmore started at the bank as a young man fresh out of college. They had sat across from each other at that same bank dozens of times. Whitmore had approved the original loan on the Halverson land. He had shaken Anders's hand and told him it was a smart investment. He had smiled and said the bank was proud to partner with families like the Sorensens. Now his voice was careful, professional, the voice of a man who had made this same phone call too many times in the past 2 years. "Mr. Sorensen," he said, "I was expecting you might call." Anders kept his own voice level. He had learned in Korea that a calm voice unnerved people more than shouting. He explained his situation. He had received the notice. He understood the bank's position. He was calling to discuss options. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Anders could hear papers shuffling. "Mr. Sorensen," Whitmore said, "I wish I had better news for you. But the decision came from above me. From the holding company. They have reviewed your account, and they have determined that the risk is no longer acceptable." Anders asked what that meant in practical terms. "It means they want their money," Whitmore said, "or they want the land. Those are the only 2 options I can offer you." Anders asked about restructuring. He had heard of other farmers negotiating new terms, stretching payments out over longer periods, reducing interest rates. Surely something could be arranged. Another pause. More paper shuffling. "I asked about that," Whitmore said. His voice dropped slightly, as if he did not want to be overheard. "I asked specifically about your account, Anders. Because of your history with us. Because your family has banked here for 3 generations. But the holding company said no. They said your debt-to-value ratio is too high. They said the collateral has depreciated beyond acceptable limits. They used a lot of words that mean the same thing." "Which is what?" Anders asked. "Which is that they do not believe you can pay," Whitmore said, "and they do not want to wait to find out they are right." Anders sat with the phone pressed to his ear, looking out the window of his office at the fields beyond. The corn had been harvested 2 weeks earlier. The soybeans were coming in now, Peter and Christian working the combine, while Anders handled the business side of things. The fields were brown and gold in the October light, beautiful in the way that only a farmer could understand. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Find $400,000 in 30 days, Whitmore said. "That is the only thing that will stop this process. And if I cannot, then the bank will take possession of the property on November 1st. There will be an auction. Your equipment, your livestock, your land. Everything. Anders thanked Robert Whitmore for his time. He meant it in a strange way. Whitmore had not pretended. He had not offered false hope. He had simply told the truth, which was more than some bankers did. After he hung up, Anders sat in his office for a long time. The combine moved across the far field, a distant shape trailing dust. His sons were out there, bringing in the harvest, not knowing that it would be their last harvest on this land, unless Anders found another way. Over the next 10 days, Anders Sorensen tried everything. He called the Farmers' Home Administration, the federal agency that was supposed to help farmers in crisis. He sat on hold for 45 minutes before reaching a caseworker who took his information and said someone would call him back. No one called. He tried again 2 days later. Same result. On his third attempt, a different caseworker told him that the FMHA was overwhelmed with applications. They were processing requests from 1982. It would be months before they could even look at his case. He does not have months, Anders said. He has 3 weeks. I understand, the caseworker said. Her voice was tired. I am sorry. He drove to Des Moines to meet with a lawyer who specialized in farm debt. The lawyer's name was Richardson. He wore a suit that cost more than Anders spent on clothes in a year. His office was in a tall building downtown, with windows that looked out over the city. Anders had never felt more out of place in his life. Richardson listened to his story, reviewed his documents, and shook his head. The bank has followed proper procedure, Richardson said. The foreclosure notice is valid. Your only options are to pay the debt, negotiate a settlement, or declare bankruptcy. Anders asked about bankruptcy. Chapter 12 was designed for situations like yours, Richardson said. It would allow you to restructure your debts and keep your farm, potentially. But there are no guarantees. The process takes months, and the legal fees would be substantial. How substantial? Anders asked. Richardson named a figure, $10,000 as a retainer. More as the case progressed. Anders did not have $10,000. He did not have $1,000. Every cent the farm generated went straight to the bank, to the equipment dealers, to the seed and fertilizer suppliers who had extended him credit when times were good and now wanted to be paid. He thanked Richardson for his time and drove the 90 miles back to Carroll County in silence. He called his congressman's office. A staffer took his information and promised that someone would be in touch. No one was. He called the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition, a group that helped farmers facing foreclosure. A woman named Margaret listened to his story with genuine sympathy. She had heard hundreds of stories just like it. She told him about protest tactics, about penny auctions where neighbors bid a cent on foreclosed equipment and returned it to the original owner, about legal maneuvers that could delay the process. But delay is not the same as stopping, she admitted. If the bank wants your land, they will get your land eventually. All we can do is make them wait. Anders did not want to make them wait. He wanted to keep his farm. He went to Bethany Lutheran Church on Sunday, October 9th, and sat in the same pew where his family had sat for 4 generations. Pastor Hendricks preached about faith in times of trial. Afterward, in the fellowship hall, Anders overheard 2 men talking about the Carlson place, which had gone to auction the previous Tuesday. The equipment had sold for 30 cents on the dollar. The land had gone to a corporate farming operation out of Minneapolis. The Carlsons themselves had moved to Omaha. Someone said they were living with relatives. Someone else said the husband had not spoken a word since the auction. Anders drank his coffee and said nothing. On October 11th, he received a second letter from the bank. This one informed him that a representative from First National would be visiting the property on October 14th to conduct an assessment prior to foreclosure proceedings. The letter listed the names of the people who would be present. Robert Whitmore, Senior Loan Officer. Carl Henderson, Licensed Auctioneer. David Marsh, Property Assessor. James Fitzgerald, Legal Counsel. And 9 others, assistants and associates and various functionaries of the machinery that was about to consume his family's legacy. 13 people in total. Anders read the list carefully. He recognized some of the names. Carl Henderson had conducted dozens of farm auctions in Carroll County over the past 3 years. David Marsh had assessed the Halverson property before Anders bought it, back when land was worth something. James Fitzgerald had handled the legal work on that same transaction, had sat across the table from Anders and explained the terms of the loan, had assured him that everything was in order. These were the people who were coming to take his farm. On the evening of October 11th, Anders called a family meeting. They gathered in the kitchen after dinner. Kirsten sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Peter stood by the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Niels sat across from his mother, a notebook open in front of him, ever the accountant, ready to calculate and analyze. Christian leaned against the counter, still wearing his work clothes, dirt under his fingernails, the youngest and the most confused about why they were all here. Anders stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He had something to say, and he needed to be standing when he said it. "You all know about the foreclosure," he began. They nodded. Of course they knew. It was impossible to keep secrets in a farmhouse. "I have spent the past 2 weeks trying to find a way out," Anders continued. "I have called the bank. I have called the government. I have talked to lawyers and advocacy groups and everyone else I could think of. And I have to tell you the truth." He paused. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same clock that had hung there since his mother bought it in 1945. "There is no way out. The bank is going to take this farm. They are sending people here on Friday to assess the property and begin the auction process. In 3 weeks, everything we have built will belong to strangers." Christian spoke first. "That is not right," he said. His voice was loud, angry. "We have not done anything wrong. We have worked this land our whole lives. How can they just take it?" Anders looked at his youngest son, the optimist, the one who still believed that fairness meant something. "They can take it because we owe them money," Anders said. "They can take it because the law says they can. They can take it because we are small and they are big and there is nobody who will stop them." "What about the protest groups?" Peter asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a man who had seen worse things than foreclosure. "I have heard they can delay auctions, get neighbors to show up, intimidate the buyers." Anders shook his head. "That might buy us a few months, but the bank will keep coming. They always do." "So what do we do?" Niels asked. He had his pen ready, as if Anders was about to dictate a plan that could be written down and executed. Anders looked at each of them in turn. His wife of 32 years, who had stood beside him through everything. His oldest son, who had gone to war and come back changed. His middle son, who understood numbers better than anyone Anders had ever met. His youngest son, who loved this land as much as Anders himself did. Then he told them. He told them about his father in 1934. He told them about the barn, about what he had found there as a 7-year-old boy. He told them about the promise he had made to himself, that he would never let the banks do to him what they had done to his father. He told them that he had kept that promise for 50 years, and he intended to keep it for whatever time he had left. When he finished speaking, the kitchen was silent. Kirsten was the first to respond. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "What exactly are you saying, Anders?" "I am saying that they will not take this land while I am alive to stop them," Anders replied. "I am saying that the men who are coming here on Friday are the same men who have destroyed 47 families in this county. The same men who show up in their suits and their nice cars and drive away with everything we have worked for. The same men who sleep well at night while farmers lose everything." He paused. "I am saying that someone needs to show them there are consequences." Peter understood first. His face went pale, then hardened into something unreadable. "You are talking about killing them," he said. It was not a question. Anders did not flinch. "I am talking about justice. I am talking about protecting what is ours. I am talking about sending a message to every bank and every holding company and every corporate farm operation that thinks they can swallow up families like us without anyone fighting back. This is insane, Niels said. His voice cracked. You are talking about mass murder. You would spend the rest of your life in prison. We all would. And what is the alternative? Anders asked. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. We lose the farm. We lose everything. Your children, Peter, they grow up with nothing. No inheritance, no legacy, no connection to the land that made this family what it is. Everything your great-great-grandfather built, gone. Sold to the highest bidder. And the men who took it from us go on to the next farm and do the same thing again. He looked around the table. They have already taken everything from us except the land itself. In 3 weeks, they will take that too. The only question is whether we let them. The silence stretched on. Then Christian spoke. I am with you, Pa. Everyone turned to look at him. The youngest, the optimist, the one who believed everything would work out. His face was different now. Something had changed behind his eyes. I have watched this happen for 3 years, Christian said. I have watched the Carlsons lose their place, the Andersons, the Mullers. Good people, hard-working people, and nobody does anything. The banks just keep taking and nobody fights back. Maybe it is time somebody did. Peter looked at his father for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I did not go to Vietnam to come home and watch strangers take everything my family built, he said. If you are doing this, I am with you. All eyes turned to Niels. He sat with his pen still in his hand, his notebook still open, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was the thoughtful one, the one who analyzed everything, the one who saw all sides of every question. This is wrong, he said quietly. You know it is wrong. Yes, Anders said, I know it is wrong, but sometimes wrong is all you have left. Niels closed his notebook. He set down his pen. He looked at his father, at his brothers, at his mother, who had not said a word since Anders finished speaking. Then he nodded. Kirsten stood up from the table. She walked to where Anders was standing, put her hands on his face, and looked into his eyes. I have been your wife for 32 years, she said. I have followed you through good times and bad. I have trusted your judgment when I could not see the path myself. She paused. I trust it now. Whatever you decide, I am with you. Anders pulled his wife close and held her. Over her shoulder he looked at his 3 sons, who were looking back at him with expressions he had never seen on their faces before. Then we are decided, he said. The meeting on Friday. The men from the bank. We show them what happens when you push a family too far. In the kitchen of the Sorensen farmhouse, on the evening of October 11th, 1983, a decision was made. It was not made lightly. It was not made without understanding the consequences. But it was made unanimously by a family that had been pushed beyond what they could endure. 3 days later, 13 men would arrive at that farm expecting to conduct a routine assessment. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The next 3 days moved with a strange kind of clarity. Anders had expected to feel something. Fear, perhaps. Doubt. The weight of what he was planning to do pressing down on his chest until he could not breathe. But instead, he felt calm. Calmer than he had felt in months. The uncertainty was gone. The endless worrying about money and banks and foreclosure notices had been replaced by something simpler. A task, a plan, a clear path forward, even if that path led somewhere he had never imagined going. On the morning of October 12th, he woke at his usual time, 4:45. He lay in the darkness, listening to Kirsten breathe, feeling the warmth of her body beside him, and he thought about what the next 3 days would bring. Then he rose, dressed, and went downstairs to start the coffee. The boys arrived at the usual times. Peter at 6:30, Christian already in the barn by 6. They did not speak about what had been decided the night before. There was work to be done, soybeans still coming in, the last of the harvest that needed to be finished before the weather turned. They worked through the morning the way they always worked, father and sons moving together with the efficiency of men who had done this their whole lives. At noon, Anders called them into the machine shed. "We need to talk about Friday," he said. They gathered around the workbench, surrounded by tools and spare parts and the smell of oil and diesel that permeated everything on a working farm. Anders had a piece of paper in his hand, a list he had made the night before while Kirsten slept. 13 people, he said. That is what the letter said. Whitmore and Henderson and Marsh and Fitzgerald and 9 others. They are scheduled to arrive at 9 in the morning. Peter nodded. He had been thinking about this too. His military training had kicked in overnight, turning the problem into something tactical, something that could be analysed and solved. "How do we want to do this?" Peter asked. Anders had already worked it out. "The barn," he said. "We invite them into the barn to look at the equipment. That is what they will expect. An assessment means looking at everything, figuring out what it is worth. They will want to see the tractors, the combine, the implements. We bring them all into the barn at once." "And then," Niels said. His voice was flat. He had not slept the night before. There were dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that had not been there yesterday. "And then we do not let them leave," Anders said. Christian shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "How?" he asked. "There are 13 of them and 4 of us." Anders looked at his youngest son. "We have the advantage of surprise. They will not be expecting anything. They will walk in thinking this is just another foreclosure, just another family giving up without a fight. By the time they understand what is happening, it will be too late." He unfolded the piece of paper in his hand. "Peter, I need you to handle the doors. Once everyone is inside, you secure the exits. Nobody leaves until we are finished." Peter nodded. "Christian, you will be with me. We will control the main group, keep them together, make sure nobody tries to be a hero." Christian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Niels," Anders continued. He looked at his middle son, the one who had argued against this, the one who had agreed only because his family had agreed. "Niels, I need you on the perimeter. Anyone tries to run, anyone makes it past Peter, you stop them." Niels did not nod. He just stared at his father with eyes that looked much older than 28. "What about the aftermath?" Peter asked. His voice was practical, tactical. 13 people do not just disappear. There will be questions, investigations. They will come looking. Anders had thought about this too. "The barn," he said again. "When it is over, we burn it. The barn, the evidence, everything. It will look like an accident, a confrontation that got out of hand, a fire that spread too fast for anyone to escape." "A fire," Niels repeated. His voice cracked slightly. "You want to burn 13 men alive?" "Not alive," Anders said. His voice was steady. "We do what needs to be done first. The fire is just to cover our tracks." The machine shed was silent, except for the wind outside, rattling the metal siding. "And then what?" Christian asked. "After. What do we do after?" Anders looked at his son. "We go on," he said. "We farm the land. We raise our families. We live our lives. The bank will send more people eventually, but by then the message will have been sent. They will think twice before they come for us again." It sounded simple when he said it. They all knew it was not simple. They all knew that what they were planning would change everything, would make them into something they had never been before. But nobody said so. The decision had been made. There was no going back now. That afternoon, Anders drove to the hardware store in Glidden, 15 miles from the farm. He paid cash for 10 gallons of kerosene, 2 lengths of heavy chain, and a padlock. The clerk was a young man Anders did not recognize, a new hire probably, someone who had moved to the area looking for work that did not exist. He did not ask any questions. He just rang up the purchase and made change, and said "have a nice day" in a voice that suggested he did not particularly care whether Anders did or not. Anders loaded the supplies into the bed of his truck and drove home. On the morning of October 13th, Peter went to the farm supply store in Carroll. He bought 50 feet of rope, a roll of duct tape, and a box of heavy-duty contractor bags. The clerk knew him. They talked about the weather, about the harvest, about the high school football team's chances against Denison on Friday night. Peter smiled and nodded and said all the right things. When he left, the clerk had no idea that anything was wrong. That afternoon, Niels drove to Manning and bought a can of gasoline at the filling station. Then he drove to Coon Rapids and bought another can at a different station. Then he drove back to the farm and put both cans in the machine shed, next to the kerosene his father had purchased the day before. Christian did not leave the farm. He spent the day in the barn, moving equipment around, creating space in the center of the building. He told himself he was just organizing, just doing the kind of work that always needed to be done. But he knew what he was really doing. He was preparing, making room for what was coming. That evening, Anders gathered his sons in the barn and walked them through the plan one more time. "They arrive at 9, he said. "I will meet them in the yard, welcome them, play the part of the defeated farmer accepting his fate. I will offer them coffee. I will be polite. I will be cooperative. They will think this is going to be easy." He pointed to the barn doors. "I will suggest we start with the equipment in the barn. That is what they are here to assess after all. They will follow me inside. All of them, hopefully. If anyone stays in the yard, Peter, that is your job. Find a reason to get them into the barn with the others." Peter nodded. "Once everyone is inside, I will give the signal," Anders continued. The signal was simple. He would take off his cap and run his hand through his hair, a gesture so natural that no one would think twice about it. "When you see that, Peter, you secure the doors. Chain them shut from the outside, then come back through the side entrance." "What about the side entrance?" Christian asked. "That is your position," Anders said. "You will be inside already, waiting. When Peter chains the main doors, you block the side entrance. Nobody gets out that way." "And then," Niels said. "And then we do what we came to do," Anders said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. They all knew what came next. "When it is over, we spread the kerosene and the gasoline. We make sure the fire will catch and spread. Then we get out, lock the side entrance behind us, and let it burn." Anders looked at each of his sons in turn. "Any questions?" he asked. There were no questions. There was nothing left to say. That night, Anders could not sleep. He lay in bed beside Kirsten, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle and creak around him. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows, making the trees scratch against the roof the way they had scratched every autumn for as long as he could remember. Kirsten was not asleep either. He could tell from the rhythm of her breathing, from the way she lay too still, too careful. She was awake, thinking the same thoughts he was thinking, facing the same questions he was facing. He reached over and took her hand. She squeezed back. Neither of them spoke. At 2 a.m, Anders gave up on sleep. He eased out of bed, pulled on his robe and went downstairs. The kitchen was dark except for the moonlight coming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. He did not turn on the light. He did not want to see clearly right now. He sat at the kitchen table, in the same chair where he had sat 10,000 times before, and he thought about what he was going to do. He thought about the men who were coming tomorrow. Robert Whitmore, who had approved his loan and was now taking his farm. Carl Henderson, who had auctioned off 40 farms in Carroll County and would auction off 40 more before he was done. David Marsh, James Fitzgerald, and 9 others whose names he did not know but whose jobs he understood perfectly. They were not evil men. That was the hardest part. They were just men doing their jobs, following orders, processing paperwork. They probably went home at night to wives and children of their own. They probably sat at kitchen tables just like this one and talked about their days and worried about their futures. But they were also the instruments of destruction. They were the hands that signed the papers, the voices that called the auctions, the faces that watched families lose everything they had built. They were part of a machine that was grinding family farms into dust, and they had chosen to be part of that machine. They could have chosen differently. They could have refused. They could have said, "No, this is wrong, I will not do this anymore." But they had not refused. They had kept showing up, kept processing foreclosures, kept collecting their salaries while farmers lost their land and their livelihoods, and sometimes their lives. Someone had to stop them. Someone had to show them that there were consequences. Someone had to draw a line and say this far, no further. Anders sat in the darkness and asked himself if he was that someone. He thought about his father. He thought about the barn in 1934, about what he had seen there as a 7-year-old boy. He thought about the promise he had made to himself, the promise that had shaped his entire life. He thought about his sons, Peter, who had already seen too much violence in his life, Niels, who had argued against this plan and agreed to it anyway, Christian, who still believed in the goodness of the world despite everything. He was asking them to become something they had never been. He was asking them to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. He was asking them to carry this weight for the rest of their lives. Did he have the right to ask that? And then he thought about the alternative. Losing the farm. Watching strangers walk away with 91 years of family history. Seeing his sons scattered, his grandchildren growing up without any connection to the land that had made them who they were. He thought about the Carlsons, living with relatives in Omaha, their farm now owned by a corporation that would never set foot on it. He thought about the Mullers, the Andersons, the Halversons, all the families he had known his whole life, all of them broken and scattered by the same forces that were coming for him. He thought about the white crosses on the courthouse lawn, multiplying every month. And he thought about the fact that nobody was doing anything to stop it. The government was not stopping it. The banks were not stopping themselves. The corporations were not suddenly developing consciences. The system was broken, and it was going to stay broken, and families like his were going to keep losing everything they had until there was nothing left to lose. Unless someone fought back. Anders sat in the kitchen until the first grey light of dawn began to show through the windows. He had not slept. He had not moved from his chair. He had simply sat and thought and wrestled with questions that had no good answers. When the light was strong enough to see by, he stood up. His knees ached from sitting too long. His back was stiff. He felt every one of his 56 years as he walked to the coffee maker and began the morning routine. By the time Kirsten came downstairs, the coffee was ready, and Anders was sitting at the table with a cup in his hands, watching the sun come up over the fields. She sat down across from him. She did not ask if he had slept. She could see that he had not. "Is today the day?" she asked. Anders nodded. "Today is the day. Are you ready?" He thought about the question. Ready was not the right word. He would never be ready for what he was about to do. But he was resolved. He was committed. He had made his decision, and he would see it through. "I am ready," he said. Kirsten reached across the table and took his hands. She held them for a long moment, feeling the calluses, the scars, the strength that 56 years of farm work had built. Then she let go. "I will make breakfast," she said. "The boys will be hungry." She stood up and went to the stove, and Anders watched her move around the kitchen the way she had moved for 32 years, efficient and graceful and utterly familiar. This might be the last morning they would have together like this, the last peaceful morning before everything changed. Anders drank his coffee and tried to memorize every detail. The boys arrived at their usual times. Peter first, then Christian from upstairs, then Niels from his apartment in town. They gathered around the kitchen table and ate the breakfast Kirsten had prepared. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, a farmer's breakfast, the kind they had eaten every morning of their lives. Nobody talked about what was coming. They talked about the weather instead, about the last of the soybeans that still needed to come in, about the forecast for the weekend, which was calling for rain. Ordinary conversation. The kind of conversation families have when they are trying not to think about something. At 8:30, Anders pushed back from the table. "It is time," he said. The boys stood up. Peter's face was calm. controlled, the face of a soldier preparing for a mission. Niels looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Christian's jaw was set, his eyes hard with a determination that Anders had never seen in his youngest son before. Kirsten stood by the stove, watching them. Anders went to her. He put his arms around her and held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beating against his chest. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the day I met you, and I will love you until the day I am gone from this world." "I know," she whispered. "I know." He kissed her then, a long kiss, the kind of kiss that tries to say everything that words cannot express. Then he let her go. "Stay in the house," he said. "No matter what you hear, stay in the house. When it is over, I will come for you." She nodded. Her eyes were dry. She had cried all her tears in the night, alone in the darkness, while Anders sat in the kitchen below. The boys said their own goodbyes to their mother. Peter hugged her briefly, the way he always did. Niels held on longer, his face buried in her shoulder. Christian kissed her cheek and told her not to worry. Everything would be fine, the optimist in him refusing to die, even now. Then they walked out the door. The morning was cool and grey, clouds covering the sky, the kind of October day that could not decide whether it wanted to rain. Anders stood in the yard and looked at his farm. The house where 4 generations of Sorensens had lived. The barn where his grandfather had milked cows, and his father had stored grain, and he himself had worked since he was old enough to walk. The fields stretching out to the horizon, 800 acres of the finest soil in Iowa. In an hour, this place would be changed forever. The men would arrive, and Anders would do what he had planned to do, and nothing would ever be the same again. He took a deep breath. The air smelled like autumn, like harvested corn and fallen leaves, and the promise of winter coming. Then he turned to his sons. "Take your positions," he said. "They will be here soon." Peter went to the machine shed to wait. Niels walked to the far side of the barn, where he could watch the road and the perimeter at the same time. Christian disappeared into the barn through the side entrance, positioning himself where he would be hidden when the visitors arrived. Anders stood alone in the yard, waiting. At 2 minutes before 9 o'clock, the first car appeared on the road. The first car was a dark blue sedan, the kind of car that bankers drove, clean and polished and utterly out of place on a dirt farm road. It came slowly, trailing a plume of dust, the driver clearly unfamiliar with the terrain. Behind it came a second car, then a third. A small convoy of men in suits coming to dismantle a family's legacy. Anders stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, watching them approach. His face showed nothing. Whatever storm was raging inside him, he had locked it away somewhere deep, somewhere it could not interfere with what needed to be done. The first car pulled into the yard and stopped. The engine cut off. The driver's door opened, and Robert Whitmore stepped out. Whitmore was wearing a grey suit and a blue tie, the same outfit he had worn to 100 foreclosure meetings before this one. His shoes were polished, his hair was combed. He looked like a man who expected this to be a routine morning, unpleasant perhaps, but manageable. Just another farm to process, another family to displace, another file to close. "Mr. Sorensen," Whitmore said. He extended his hand as he walked across the yard. "Thank you for agreeing to this assessment. I know it is not easy." Anders shook the offered hand. His grip was firm, his palm dry. Nothing in his manner suggested that anything was wrong. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "welcome to our farm." The other cars had parked now, and men were emerging from them like ants from a disturbed hill. Anders counted them as they gathered in the yard. Whitmore. Carl Henderson, the auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a red face and a loud voice that carried across the morning air. David Marsh, the assessor, carrying a clipboard and a camera. James Fitzgerald, the lawyer, thin and precise, already making notes on a legal pad. And 9 others, assistants and associates, young men in cheap suits who had probably never set foot on a working farm in their lives. 13 men, just as the letter had said. "Can I offer you gentlemen some coffee?" Anders asked. His voice was pleasant, hospitable, the voice of a man who had accepted his fate and was trying to make the best of it. "My wife made a fresh pot this morning." Whitmore glanced at his watch. "That is very kind, Mr. Sorensen, but we have a tight schedule today. Perhaps we should get started with the assessment." "Of course," Anders said. "Where would you like to begin?" Henderson stepped forward. "The equipment," he said. His voice was exactly as loud as Anders had expected, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard across crowded auction yards. "I will need to see everything. Tractors, combines, implements, anything with a motor or a value." Anders nodded. "Most of our equipment is in the barn. If you will follow me, I can show you what we have." He turned and began walking toward the barn, not looking back, trusting that they would follow. They did. 13 pairs of feet crunching across the gravel, 13 men in suits trailing a farmer in work clothes, all of them moving toward the large red structure that had stood on this property since 1892. The barn doors were open wide. Anders had opened them that morning, wanting the space to look inviting, wanting the men to walk in without hesitation. Inside, the equipment was arranged neatly, just as Christian had positioned it the day before. 2 tractors, a combine harvester, a seed drill, a cultivator, various implements and attachments. The accumulated machinery of a working farm, worth perhaps $100,000 at auction, worth far more than that to the family that had used it for generations. Anders led the group inside. The men spread out, examining the equipment, making notes, taking photographs. Henderson was already talking about lot numbers and reserve prices, his auctioneer's mind calculating values and commissions. Marsh moved from machine to machine with his clipboard, recording serial numbers and conditions. The younger men stood in clusters, looking uncomfortable, clearly wishing they were somewhere else. Anders positioned himself near the center of the barn, watching them work. His heart was beating faster now, but his hands were steady. He had waited 50 years for this moment. He could wait a few more minutes. Peter was outside, he knew. Waiting by the doors with the chain and the padlock. Christian was in the shadows at the back of the barn, hidden behind a stack of hay bales. Niels was on the perimeter, watching the yard, making sure no one had stayed behind. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. Whitmore approached Anders with a document in his hand. "Mr. Sorensen," he said, "I need you to sign this form acknowledging the assessment. It is just a formality, but we need it for our records." Anders took the paper and pretended to read it. His eyes moved across the words, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating distances, counting seconds, preparing for what came next. Then he looked up. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "there is something I need to say to all of you before we continue." His voice carried across the barn, cutting through the murmur of conversation, the scratch of pens on paper, the click of camera shutters. One by one, the men stopped what they were doing and turned to look at him. Anders waited until he had their full attention. 13 faces, some curious, some impatient, some indifferent. 13 men who had come to take everything he had. "My family has worked this land for 91 years, he said. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had rehearsed these words in his mind 1,000 times. "My great-grandfather cleared these fields with his own hands. My grandfather built this barn. My father raised me here, and I raised my sons here, and I had hoped to see my grandchildren raised here too." He paused. The barn was silent. "But you have decided that 91 years of history is worth less than a number on a balance sheet. You have decided that my family's legacy can be bought and sold like livestock at auction. You have decided that we do not matter." Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Sorensen, I understand this is difficult, but the bank has no choice. You signed a loan agreement. You have not met your obligations." The law is clear. The law, Anders repeated. He let the word hang in the air. Yes. The law is clear. The law says you can take a man's farm because interest rates went up and crop prices went down. The law says you can destroy a family because numbers on a spreadsheet did not add up the way you expected. The law says that 91 years of work and sacrifice and love mean nothing compared to a $400,000 debt. He looked around the barn, meeting each man's eyes in turn. I have spent my whole life following the law, he said. I have paid my taxes and honored my contracts and treated my neighbors fairly. I have done everything I was supposed to do. And in return, the law has decided to destroy me. His hand moved to his cap. So I have decided, Anders said quietly, that the law no longer applies. He removed his cap and ran his hand through his hair. For a moment, nothing happened. The men in suits stared at him, confused, uncertain what he meant. Some of them probably thought he was simply venting, releasing the frustration that every foreclosed farmer felt. Some of them were already composing the stories they would tell at dinner that night, about the crazy old farmer who gave a speech in his barn. Then the doors slammed shut. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a thunderclap of wood and metal that made every man in the barn jump. Several of them cried out. One of the younger associates stumbled backward into a tractor tire and nearly fell. Outside, Peter was wrapping the chain through the door handles, securing the padlock, sealing the only exit large enough for a group of men to pass through. "What the hell?" Henderson shouted. His red face had gone redder. "What is going on here?" At the back of the barn, Christian emerged from behind the hay bales. He was carrying a hunting rifle, the same rifle his grandfather had used to shoot deer in the 1940s. He did not point it at anyone. He did not need to. The mere presence of the weapon changed everything. The men in suits froze. Whatever they had expected from this assessment, it was not this. Their eyes moved from Christian with the rifle to Anders standing in the center of the barn, to the closed doors that now trapped them inside. "Mr. Sorensen," Whitmore said. His voice had lost its professional smoothness. It cracked slightly on the second syllable. "Please, whatever you are thinking of doing, it is not too late to stop. We can talk about this. We can find a solution." Anders shook his head slowly. "We are past talking, Mr. Whitmore. I have talked to you. I have talked to your supervisors. I have talked to lawyers and government agencies and everyone else who was supposed to help. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. You all just kept pushing, kept taking, kept grinding families like mine into dust." He walked toward Whitmore, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. 47 farms in this county, Anders said. 47 families destroyed. And you were there for most of them, were you not, Mr. Whitmore? You signed the papers. You approved the foreclosures. You watched families weep as everything they had built was sold to strangers. "I was doing my job," Whitmore said. His voice was pleading now. "I do not make the policies. I just follow the rules." "Yes," Anders said. "You were just following the rules. Everyone is always just following the rules. The loan officers follow the rules. The auctioneers follow the rules. The assessors and the lawyers and all the rest of you, you are all just following the rules. And somehow, while everyone is busy following the rules, families lose everything and nobody is responsible." He stopped directly in front of Whitmore, close enough to see the sweat beading on the banker's forehead. "Today," Anders said, "the rules are going to change." The side door opened and Peter stepped into the barn. He was carrying a shotgun, a pump-action Remington that had belonged to his father before him. He positioned himself by the door, blocking the only remaining exit. 13 men, 4 Sorensens, 3 firearms. The arithmetic was simple. The men in suits understood it immediately. Several of them began to pray. Anders could hear the murmured words, fragments of psalms and pleas to God. Others stood in shocked silence, their minds refusing to accept what was happening. One of the younger associates, a boy who could not have been more than 25, began to weep. "Please," the young man said. "I have a wife. We just had a baby. Please do not do this." Anders looked at him. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his expensive suit rumpled, his professional composure completely shattered. "What is your name?" Anders asked. The young man swallowed. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Brennan." "Thomas," Anders said. He spoke gently, almost kindly. "I am sorry you are here today. I am sorry you chose to be part of this. But you made a choice. You could have been anything, a teacher, a farmer, a carpenter. Instead, you chose to work for men who destroy families for profit. You chose to be part of the machine." "I needed a job," Thomas said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I have student loans. I have bills. I did not know it would be like this." "None of us knew," Anders said. "None of us knew how bad it would get. But here we are." He turned away from the young man and addressed the group. "I want you all to understand something," he said. "I am not a monster. I am not a madman. I am a farmer who has been pushed too far by a system that does not care whether I live or die. Everything that happens in this barn today is a consequence of choices that you made. You chose to foreclose on my farm. You chose to come here today. You chose to be the instruments of my family's destruction." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I did not choose this," Anders continued. "I would have been happy to live out my days on this land, to pass it on to my sons, to watch my grandchildren play in these fields. That was all I ever wanted. A simple life. A good life. The life my grandfather dreamed of when he cleared this land 91 years ago." His voice hardened. "But you took that dream away from me. You and the banks and the holding companies and all the others who decided that profit mattered more than people. You looked at my family and you saw a number on a balance sheet and you decided that number was not good enough." He looked around the barn one final time. "Now you are going to learn what it feels like to be on the other side of that equation. You are going to learn what it means to have everything taken from you, with no warning and no appeal and no mercy." Whitmore fell to his knees. He was openly weeping now, the professional mask completely gone. "I have children," he said. "2 daughters. Please, Mr. Sorensen, I will do anything. I will tear up the foreclosure papers. I will tell the bank I made a mistake. Just please let me see my girls again." Anders looked down at the kneeling man. For a moment, something flickered in his pale blue eyes, something that might have been doubt or pity or the last remnants of the mercy he had once believed in. Then it was gone. "Your daughters will grow up without a father," Anders said quietly. "Just like the children of all the farmers whose lives you destroyed. Just like the sons and daughters who watched their parents lose everything because men like you decided it was more profitable to foreclose than to negotiate." He stepped back. "The difference is that your daughters will know why. They will know that their father was part of a system that crushed families without remorse. And maybe, when they are old enough to understand, they will make different choices than you did." Whitmore collapsed completely, sobbing into the dirt floor of the barn. Anders turned to his sons. "It is time," he said. What happened next would be described in court documents and newspaper articles and academic papers for decades to come. It would be called the Iowa Harvest Massacre, the deadliest act of rural violence in the state's history, a tragedy that shocked the nation and forced a reckoning with the human cost of the farm crisis. But in that barn, in those final minutes, it was something simpler and more terrible. It was a father and his sons doing what they believed had to be done. It was the sound of desperate men pleading for their lives. It was the smell of gunpowder and fear, and the particular metallic scent that fills the air when violence has been committed. Some of the men tried to run. There was nowhere to go. The doors were chained, the side entrance blocked, the windows too small and too high for a grown man to climb through. They were trapped, and they knew it, and their knowledge made them frantic with terror. Some of the men tried to fight. They were bankers and lawyers and assessors, men who had never thrown a punch in their adult lives. They were facing a combat veteran, a farmer with 50 years of hard labor in his arms, and 2 young men who had grown up wrestling cattle and hauling equipment. The struggles were brief and one-sided. Some of the men simply stood and waited for the end. They prayed, or they wept, or they stared straight ahead with eyes that had already accepted what was coming. These were the hardest for Anders to face. Not because they resisted, but because they did not. Because their acceptance forced him to confront what he was doing in a way that fighting did not. One by one, the men fell. Carl Henderson, the auctioneer who had sold 40 farms in Carroll County, who had stood on makeshift stages and called out prices while families watched their lives disappear. He did not beg. He did not plead. He simply looked at Anders with something like understanding in his eyes, as if he had always known this day would come, and said, "I suppose I had this coming." David Marsh, the assessor, who had walked through 100 farmhouses making notes about what they were worth, reducing lifetimes of work to numbers on a clipboard. He tried to bargain, offering to falsify his report, to say the property was worthless, to do anything if they would just let him go. His offers grew more desperate as the minutes passed, and then they stopped. James Fitzgerald, the lawyer who had drafted foreclosure documents with the same care he had once drafted wills and contracts and all the ordinary paperwork of ordinary lives. He quoted legal precedents even at the end, as if the law could still protect him, as if the rules he had spent his career enforcing still applied in this barn where the rules had been suspended. And Robert Whitmore, the loan officer, the man who had shaken Anders's hand and told him it was a smart investment, the man who had smiled and said the bank was proud to partner with families like the Sorensens. He died last because Anders had saved him for last, because Whitmore more than any of the others represented what had been done to his family. At the end, Whitmore stopped pleading. He stopped weeping. He looked at Anders with eyes that had been emptied of hope, and he asked a single question. Was it worth it? Anders thought about the question. He thought about the land and his father, and the promise he had made 50 years ago in another barn on a November night. He thought about his sons who would carry this day with them for the rest of their lives. He thought about Kirsten, waiting in the house, not knowing yet what had been done in her name. "Ask me in 50 years, he said, and then it was over. The barn was quiet now, except for the ragged breathing of the Sorensen men. They stood among the fallen, 4 farmers in work clothes, surrounded by what remained of 13 men in suits. The morning light came through the gaps in the barn siding, thin beams of grey illumination that fell across the scene like bars of a cage. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. Finally, Anders broke the silence. "The kerosene," he said. His voice was hoarse. "We need to finish this." Peter moved first, retrieving the cans of kerosene and gasoline from where they had been hidden behind the hay bales. His hands were shaking, but his movements were efficient, the movements of a soldier completing a mission. He began to pour the accelerant along the walls, around the equipment, over everything that would burn. Christian helped him, working in silence, his face pale and his eyes fixed on some middle distance that did not include the bodies on the floor. He had aged 10 years in the past hour. The optimist was gone, replaced by something harder and colder, something that would never quite go away. Niels stood by the side door, watching but not participating. He had done his part. He had blocked the escape route, had prevented anyone from fleeing into the fields. But he had not pulled a trigger, had not struck a blow, had tried to hold on to some last shred of the person he had been before this morning. Whether that shred would survive the coming days, he did not know. When the kerosene had been spread, Anders took a box of matches from his pocket. The same matches he used to light the pilot on the water heater. The same matches his father had used to light his pipe in the evenings. Ordinary wooden matches that had sat in the kitchen drawer for years. He struck one match and held it up, watching the flame dance in the draft that came through the barn walls. 91 years, he said softly. My grandfather built this barn. My father was born in the house it stands beside. I have worked in this building every day of my life since I was old enough to hold a pitchfork. He looked at his sons. I am sorry, he said, I am sorry I brought you into this. I am sorry I asked you to do what you have done. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that this was my choice, not yours. I will carry the weight of it." Peter shook his head. "We are family, Pa. We made the choice together. We carry it together." Christian nodded, and even Niels, who had not wanted any of this, who had argued against it until the end, added his agreement. Anders looked at them, his 3 sons, the men he had raised to be farmers and had instead made into something else. He loved them more in that moment than he had ever loved anything in his life. Then he dropped the match. The fire caught immediately, racing along the trails of kerosene and gasoline, climbing the walls, spreading across the floor. The heat built quickly, forcing the men back, pushing them toward the side door where escape waited. Anders was the last one out. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the flames consume the barn where his grandfather had worked, where his father had died in a different way, where he himself had spent 50 years of mornings and evenings and all the hours in between. "Goodbye," he said quietly. Then he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The Sorensen men stood in the yard and watched the barn burn. The flames climbed higher, eating through the old wood, sending sparks spiraling into the grey October sky. Black smoke billowed upward, visible for miles in every direction, a signal that something terrible had happened on this quiet farm in Carroll County. Somewhere inside, the equipment was burning too. The tractors and the combine and all the machinery that had been assessed and catalogued and valued for auction. The paperwork that David Marsh had prepared so carefully. The legal documents that James Fitzgerald had brought for signatures. All of it turning to ash and smoke and memory. And 13 men who would never go home to their families. Anders put his hand on Peter's shoulder. "Go to your mother," he said. "Tell her it is done. Tell her to pack a bag. Just the essentials, nothing more. We need to be ready for what comes next." Peter nodded and walked toward the house. Christian followed a moment later, his steps unsteady, his face still carrying that 1,000-yard stare that Peter had brought home from Vietnam. Niels remained beside his father, watching the barn burn. "What happens now?" he asked. Anders did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the phone calls that would be made when the men failed to return to their offices. He was thinking about the sheriff's deputies who would come asking questions. He was thinking about the investigators and the reporters and all the others who would descend on this farm in the hours and days to come. "We wait," he said finally. "We do not run. Running is an admission of guilt. We wait here, on our land, and we face whatever comes." "They will arrest us," Niels said. "Yes," Anders said. "They will. We will spend the rest of our lives in prison." "Probably," Anders said. Niels was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been burning in him since the night of the family meeting. "Was it worth it, Pa? Did we accomplish anything, or did we just destroy ourselves for nothing?" Anders looked at his son. He saw the doubt in Niels's eyes, the guilt, the desperate need to believe that what they had done had meaning. "I do not know," Anders said honestly. "I do not know if it was worth it. I do not know if anything will change because of what we did. Maybe the banks will keep foreclosing. Maybe the corporations will keep swallowing up family farms. Maybe everything we sacrificed today will be forgotten in a year." He turned back to the burning barn. "But I know this," he continued. "For 91 years, my family has worked this land. We have survived droughts and floods and depressions and wars. We have bent, but we have never broken. We have always fought for what was ours." The roof of the barn collapsed inward, sending a column of sparks into the sky. "Today," Anders said, "we fought one more time, not because we knew we would win, not because we thought we could change the world, but because fighting is who we are, because surrender was never an option for the men who built this farm, and it will not be an option for me." He looked at Niels with eyes that held neither regret nor triumph, only a kind of exhausted peace. "Your grandfather gave up," Anders said quietly. He let them break him, and he made a choice that I have carried with me every day since. I swore I would never make that same choice. I swore I would go down fighting if I had to go down at all. He gestured toward the burning barn, toward the smoke rising into the October sky, toward everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. "This is me fighting," he said. "This is me keeping the promise I made to myself when I was 7 years old. Whatever happens next, whatever price we pay, at least I know that I did not surrender. At least I know that I stood up." Niels did not respond. There was nothing to say. The barn continued to burn, and the smoke continued to rise, and somewhere in the distance, the first sirens began to wail. Anders put his arm around his son's shoulders. "Come," he said. "Let us go inside. Your mother will be worried." They walked together toward the house, father and son, leaving the fire behind them. The flames painted their shadows long across the yard, stretching toward the fields that had been worked by Sorensens for nearly a century. By nightfall, those fields would be surrounded by police cars and news vans and all the machinery of a society confronting something it did not want to understand. But for now, in this moment, there was only the fire and the smoke and the silence of a family that had crossed a line from which there was no return. The Iowa Harvest Massacre was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The first call came into the Carroll County Sheriff's Department at 11:47 in the morning. A farmer named Harold Gustafson was driving his truck along County Road E57 when he saw the smoke. A thick black column rising from the direction of the Sorensen place, too dark and too heavy to be a brush fire or a controlled burn. He pulled to the side of the road and watched it for a full minute, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then he drove to the nearest house with a telephone and called the sheriff. "Fire at the Sorensen farm," he told the dispatcher. "Big one. Looks like the barn." The dispatcher thanked him and made the appropriate notifications. A fire truck was dispatched from Carroll, 15 miles away. A deputy was sent to investigate. Standard procedure for a rural structure fire, nothing that suggested anything out of the ordinary. Deputy Wayne Erickson arrived at the Sorensen farm at 12:23. He had been a deputy for 11 years, had responded to hundreds of calls in that time, had seen car accidents and bar fights and domestic disputes and all the ordinary tragedies of small-town law enforcement. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he found that afternoon. The barn was fully engulfed when he arrived, flames shooting 30 feet into the air, heat so intense he could feel it from the yard. The Sorensen family was standing near the house, watching it burn. Anders and Kirsten, Peter and his wife Sarah, Niels and Christian. They stood in a loose cluster, their faces lit by the firelight, none of them making any move to fight the blaze. Erickson approached them carefully. Something felt wrong. He could not have said what it was exactly, but his instincts were telling him that this was not a normal fire. "Mr. Sorensen," he said, "what happened here?" Anders turned to look at him. His face was calm, almost serene. There was no panic in his eyes, no urgency, none of the desperate energy that people usually showed when their property was burning. "There was a meeting," Anders said. "Some men from the bank. Things got out of hand." Erickson did not understand. "What do you mean, out of hand?" Anders looked back at the burning barn. "They are still inside," he said. For a moment, the words did not register. Erickson's mind refused to process them, refused to accept what the old farmer was telling him. Then the meaning hit him like a physical blow, and he felt his stomach drop. "How many?" he asked. His voice came out strange, high and tight. 13, Anders said. Erickson reached for his radio. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He called for backup, for ambulances, for the fire department to hurry, for anyone who could help. His voice cracked as he spoke, the professional calm of 11 years dissolving in the face of something he had never imagined. The fire trucks arrived 20 minutes later. By then, the barn had collapsed into a pile of burning rubble, flames still licking at the debris, smoke still pouring into the sky. The firefighters did what they could, pouring water on the edges of the blaze, trying to prevent it from spreading to the nearby outbuildings. But everyone knew it was too late. Whatever had been in that barn was gone. More deputies arrived, then state troopers, then investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. The Sorensen farm, quiet and isolated just hours before, became the center of a rapidly expanding operation. Yellow tape went up around the perimeter. Officers began canvassing the area, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. Anders Sorensen did not resist when they came to arrest him. He was sitting on the porch with Kirsten, holding her hand, watching the organized chaos unfold in his yard. When Deputy Eriksson approached with handcuffs, Anders simply stood up and extended his wrists. "I am ready," he said. Eriksson hesitated. In 11 years of law enforcement, he had arrested men for assault, for theft, for drunk driving, for all the petty crimes that filled the county jail on any given night. He had never arrested anyone for mass murder. He did not know the proper protocol, the right words to say, the correct way to handle a situation that had no precedent in his experience. "Mr. Sorensen," he said finally, "you are under arrest for—" He trailed off, uncertain how to complete the sentence. "For murder," Anders said quietly. 13 counts. "I know what I did, Deputy. I am not going to pretend otherwise." The other Sorensen men were arrested one by one. Peter came quietly, his face showing nothing, the soldier's discipline holding even now. Christian wept as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, the tears he had held back all morning finally breaking through. Niels had to be helped to the patrol car, his legs barely supporting him, his body finally surrendering to the shock that his mind had been holding at bay. Kirsten was not arrested. She had been in the house throughout, had not participated in what happened in the barn, had committed no crime beyond knowing what her husband and sons intended to do. But she watched them take her family away, one by one, her face carved from stone, her eyes following each patrol car until it disappeared down the dirt road. Sarah, Peter's wife, stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. By evening, the story had spread beyond Carroll County. Local news stations interrupted their regular programming to report on what they were calling a developing situation at a farm in western Iowa. By nightfall, the national networks had picked up the story. CNN, ABC, NBC, all of them leading with the same basic facts. 13 dead, 4 arrested. A farm foreclosure gone horribly wrong. The details emerged slowly over the following days. The identities of the victims were released one by one, each name adding another layer of tragedy to the story. Robert Whitmore, 45, survived by a wife and 2 daughters. Carl Henderson, 50, survived by a wife, 3 sons, and 7 grandchildren. David Marsh, 38, survived by a wife and 1 son. James Fitzgerald, 52, survived by a wife. Thomas Brennan, 25, survived by a wife and an infant daughter born just 3 weeks before his death. Each obituary brought new details, new faces, new families shattered by what had happened in that barn. The newspapers printed photographs of the victims, smiling men in suits and ties, images from company picnics and family gatherings, and all the ordinary moments of lives cut short. Their widows gave tearful interviews, their children appeared on the evening news, their colleagues spoke of shock and disbelief and the terrible randomness of tragedy. And in Carroll County, among the farmers who had known the Sorensens for generations, the reaction was something more complicated. At the grain elevator in Glidden, men gathered in small groups and spoke in low voices. At the diner in Manning, waitresses poured coffee for customers who sat in silence, staring at newspapers they did not read. At churches throughout the county, pastors struggled to find words for what had happened, struggled to reconcile the Anders Sorensen they had known with the Anders Sorensen who was now facing 13 counts of first-degree murder. "I do not condone what he did," said Harold Gustafson, the farmer who had called in the fire. "No one with a conscience could condone it. But I understand why he did it. I understand the desperation. I have felt it myself. This sentiment echoed across the county, across the state, across the entire Midwest, where farmers were losing their land and their livelihoods to the same forces that had driven Anders Sorensen over the edge. Talk radio programs were flooded with callers. Letters to the editor filled newspaper pages. People who had never met the Sorensens, who had never set foot in Iowa, found themselves debating questions they had never considered before. How much can a man lose before he breaks? What is the difference between murder and self-defense when the weapon being used against you is a foreclosure notice? Is there such a thing as justified violence against a system designed to destroy you? The politicians weighed in, of course. Governor Terry Branstad called the massacre a senseless tragedy and urged Iowans to reject violence as a response to economic hardship. Senator Tom Harkin spoke on the Senate floor about the urgent need for farm debt relief, invoking the Sorensen name as evidence of a crisis that could no longer be ignored. In Washington, lobbyists for agricultural interests used the killings to push for legislation they had been advocating for years. Nobody asked the Sorensens what they thought. They were in the Carroll County Jail, held without bail, awaiting trial for crimes that could send them to prison for the rest of their lives. The trial began in February of 1984, after a change of venue moved the proceedings to Des Moines, where the court hoped to find jurors who had not already formed opinions about the case. It was a futile hope. By February, everyone in Iowa had an opinion about Anders Sorensen. Everyone in America had an opinion. The trial was not about determining guilt or innocence. It was about bearing witness, about creating a record, about giving the system a chance to respond to what had been done to it. The prosecution's case was straightforward. 13 men had arrived at the Sorensen farm on the morning of October 14th. None of them had left alive. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of the Sorensen men themselves, who had confessed fully and without reservation, removed any doubt about what had happened. James Wilson, the lead prosecutor, did not need to be creative. He simply presented the facts, one after another, building a case that was unassailable in its simplicity. He showed photographs of the victims. He read their names into the record. He called their widows and children to the stand, let the jury see the human cost of what the Sorensens had done. The defense tried. Harold Richardson, the same lawyer Anders had consulted months before, had taken the case pro bono, driven by something he could not quite explain. He argued diminished capacity, citing the extreme stress of impending foreclosure. He presented expert witnesses who testified about the psychological effects of financial ruin, about the epidemic of rural despair that was sweeping the Midwest. He put Anders on the stand and let him tell his story, from his father's death in 1934 to the foreclosure notice in September, to the decision that had led to 13 deaths. The jury listened. They heard about the farm crisis, about the interest rates and the falling land values and the 500 auctions every month. They heard about the white crosses on courthouse lawns and the families scattered to distant cities. They heard about a promise made by a 7-year-old boy in a barn 50 years ago. And then they deliberated for 6 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Anders Sorensen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Peter received the same sentence. Christian and Niels, who had participated but had not directly caused any deaths, were sentenced to 40 years each. At the sentencing hearing, the judge asked Anders if he had anything to say. Anders stood slowly. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit now, his wrists shackled, his hair greyer than it had been 6 months before. He looked at the judge, at the jury, at the families of his victims who filled the gallery. "I am not going to apologize," he said. His voice was quiet but steady. "I am not going to pretend I did not know what I was doing, or that I did not mean to do it. I killed 13 men because they were going to take everything my family had built over 91 years. I killed them because the system gave me no other choice. I killed them because surrender was not something I was capable of." He paused. "I know that what I did was wrong by the standards of the law. I know that I will spend the rest of my life paying for it. I accept that. I accepted it before I ever struck the match." He looked at the families in the gallery, at the widows and children of the men he had killed. To the families of the men who died, he said, "I am sorry for your loss. I am sorry that your husbands and fathers will not come home. I am sorry that your children will grow up without them. They did not deserve to die. They were not evil men. They were just part of a system that has destroyed thousands of families like mine." His voice hardened slightly. "But I want you to understand something," he continued. "Your husbands and fathers made choices. They chose to work for institutions that were crushing people. They chose to foreclose on farms and auction off equipment and watch families weep without ever questioning whether what they were doing was right. They were not innocent. They were part of a machine, and machines do not stop unless someone stops them." He turned back to the judge. "I stopped them," Anders said. "For one day, in one barn, I stopped them. And if that makes me a monster, then I will be a monster. But at least I will be a monster who fought back." The judge listened without expression. When Anders finished, he pronounced the sentence that everyone already knew was coming. Life without parole. No possibility of early release. Anders Sorensen would die in prison. Anders nodded, as if the sentence was exactly what he expected. Then he turned and walked back to the defense table, where his sons were waiting for him. Peter clasped his hand. Christian embraced him. Even Niels, who had struggled the most with what they had done, put his arm around his father's shoulders. They were led out of the courtroom together, a family still, even in chains. The years passed. Anders Sorensen was incarcerated at the Iowa State Penitentiary in Fort Madison, a maximum security facility on the banks of the Mississippi River. He was a model prisoner. He never caused trouble, never got into fights, never gave the guards any reason to discipline him. He worked in the prison library, shelving books and helping other inmates with their legal research. He attended chapel services every Sunday, sitting in the same pew week after week, listening to sermons about forgiveness and redemption and grace. Kirsten visited him every month for the first 5 years. She would drive the 3 hours from Carroll County, sit across from him in the visiting room, and hold his hands while they talked about nothing important. The weather, the crops, how the grandchildren were growing. She never asked him if he regretted what he had done, and he never volunteered an answer. In 1989, Kirsten suffered a stroke. She survived, but her health declined rapidly after that. The monthly visits became every other month, then quarterly, then stopped altogether. She was too weak to make the drive, and the prison did not allow conjugal visits for inmates serving life sentences. She passed away in the spring of 1991, in the farmhouse where she had lived for 40 years. Sarah was with her at the end, holding her hand, telling her that Anders sent his love. Kirsten's last words were about him. "Tell him I will wait for him," she said, "however long it takes." Anders learned of her death 3 days later, when the prison chaplain called him into his office and delivered the news. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall, his face showing nothing. Then he thanked the chaplain and returned to his cell. That night, the guards reported hearing sounds from Anders Sorensen's cell. Not crying, exactly. More like the keening of an animal in pain, a low and terrible sound that went on for hours. By morning, it had stopped. Anders emerged for breakfast, looking older than his 64 years, his eyes empty, his movements slow and mechanical. He never spoke of Kirsten again. Peter served his sentence at the same facility, though he and his father were not permitted contact. He adjusted to prison life with the same stoic discipline he had brought home from Vietnam. He exercised every day, read voraciously, earned a college degree through a correspondence program. His wife Sarah visited faithfully for the first decade, bringing photographs of the children, keeping him connected to the family he had left behind. In 1997, Sarah filed for divorce. She did not explain her reasons in the papers, but Peter understood. 14 years is a long time to wait for someone who will never come home. She remarried 2 years later, a banker from Omaha, which Peter found grimly amusing when he heard the news. His children grew up without him. Emma became a nurse, moved to Minneapolis, had children of her own that Peter would never meet. Thomas went to law school, became a public defender, spent his career representing people who could not afford representation. When asked about his father, he gave the same answer every time. He did a terrible thing. I love him anyway. Niels was paroled in 2007 after serving 24 years of his 40-year sentence. He was 52 years old, his hair gone completely grey, his body stooped from decades of prison labor. He returned to Carroll County, but everything had changed. The farm had been sold years ago, broken up into parcels and absorbed by larger operations. The house where he had eaten breakfast with his family on the morning of October 14, 1983, had been demolished. There was nothing left but an empty field and a historical marker that briefly mentioned what had happened there. Niels tried to rebuild his life. He worked odd jobs, lived in a small apartment in Carroll, attended the same Lutheran church where his family had worshipped for 4 generations. But the weight of what he had done never left him. He would wake in the night, heart pounding, the smell of smoke and kerosene sharp in his nostrils, the sounds of pleading men echoing in his ears. He passed away quietly in 2019, alone in his apartment. The coroner ruled it natural causes, heart failure, the kind of death that comes to men who have carried too much for too long. He was 64 years old, the same age his father had been when Kirsten died. Christian never adjusted to prison. The optimism that had defined him, the belief that everything would work out, shattered completely in the aftermath of what he had done. He became withdrawn, refused visits from family, stopped responding to letters. The prison psychiatrists diagnosed depression, prescribed medications that he sometimes took and sometimes did not. In 1994, Christian was found unresponsive in his cell. He had managed to obtain a length of electrical cord from the prison workshop, had tied it to the bars of his window, had made a choice that his grandfather had made 60 years before in another place for similar reasons. He was 35 years old. Anders learned of his youngest son's death the same way he had learned of his wife's death, sitting in the chaplain's office, listening to words that did not seem real. This time he did not keen in the night. He simply returned to his cell and sat on his bunk, staring at the wall for 3 days straight. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He did not speak to anyone. On the 4th day, he returned to his routine: library duty, chapel services, meals in the cafeteria. The same schedule he had followed for 11 years. The same schedule he would follow for the rest of his life. But something had gone out of him. The guards noticed it. The other inmates noticed it. The man who had once radiated a quiet authority, who had commanded respect even in an orange jumpsuit, was diminished somehow, hollowed out from the inside. Anders Sorensen died on March 12, 2003, in the prison infirmary. Lung cancer, diagnosed too late for treatment, the kind of death that comes slowly and painfully. He was 76 years old. He had spent the last 20 years of his life behind bars. Peter was permitted to visit him at the end. They sat together in the infirmary, father and son, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic. They did not talk about the barn, or the fire, or the 13 men who had died. They talked about the farm, about the way the corn looked in August, tall and green and full of promise, about the smell of the soil after spring rain, about the sound of the wind moving through the fields at harvest time. "I miss it," Anders said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I miss the land." "I know, Pa," Peter said. "I miss it too." Anders was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been waiting for 20 years. "Was it worth it?" he asked. "Everything we lost, everything we gave up. Was any of it worth it?" Peter looked at his father, at the wasted body, at the eyes that still held the pale blue of Iowa winter sky. "I do not know," he said honestly. "I have thought about it every day since. I still do not know." Anders nodded slowly. "Neither do I," he said. He died that night, with Peter holding his hand. They buried him next to Kirsten in the small cemetery at Bethany Lutheran Church. The service was brief. A handful of people attended, those few who remembered Anders Sorensen as he had been before October 14, 1983. The pastor spoke about forgiveness and redemption and the mysterious workings of grace. Nobody mentioned the 13 men who had died in the barn. The headstone was simple: Anders Erik Sorensen. March 7, 1927 to March 12, 2003. Beloved husband and father. The same words that appeared on 1,000 headstones in 1,000 country cemeteries across Iowa. Nothing to indicate that the man buried beneath it had become one of the most notorious figures in the state's history. Peter was returned to prison after the funeral. He served another 16 years before his own death in 2019, still incarcerated, still paying for what had happened in that barn. He was 78 years old. His children did not learn of his passing until a week after the fact, when the prison notified them by mail. The farm itself had long since vanished. The land was still there, of course, still some of the richest soil in Iowa, still producing corn and soybeans every season. But it belonged to a corporation now, one of the large agricultural operations that had swallowed up family farms throughout the county. No Sorensens worked it, no Sorensens lived on it. The connection between the family and the land, 91 years of history, had been severed completely. A historical marker stands near where the barn once stood. It was erected in 2008, on the 25th anniversary of the massacre. The text is brief and neutral, giving the basic facts without commentary. On October 14, 1983, 13 men were killed on this site in an incident related to farm foreclosure. The marker does not mention Anders Sorensen by name. It does not explain what drove him to do what he did. It simply notes that something happened here, something important enough to mark but too complicated to explain. People stop sometimes to read it. Tourists passing through, history buffs researching the farm crisis, students working on papers about rural violence in America. They stand in the empty field, looking at the words on the marker, trying to understand. Most of them cannot. The world has changed too much since 1983. The farm crisis is history now, a chapter in textbooks, something that happened to other people in another time. The desperation that drove Anders Sorensen, the hopelessness that made 13 deaths seem like a reasonable response to a foreclosure notice, is difficult to imagine from the comfort of the present. But some of them can. The farmers who stop, the ones whose families have worked the land for generations, the ones who still wake at 4:45 every morning and go to bed with dirt under their fingernails. They read the marker and they nod slowly, not in approval, but in recognition. They understand what Anders Sorensen felt, even if they would never do what he did. They understand the weight of legacy, the terror of losing everything, the rage that builds when the system designed to help you becomes the instrument of your destruction. And they wonder sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, whether they might be capable of the same thing, whether anyone might be. The Iowa Harvest Massacre of 1983 did not change the system. Banks continued to foreclose on farms. Corporations continued to swallow up family operations. The number of farms in Iowa continued to decline year after year until the agricultural landscape that Anders Sorensen had known was almost unrecognizable. But something shifted in the aftermath. The violence at the Sorensen farm forced a conversation that politicians and bankers had been avoiding. It put a human face on the farm crisis, made it impossible to pretend that foreclosure was simply a matter of numbers on a balance sheet. In 1986, Congress passed Chapter 12 bankruptcy protection for family farmers, making it easier to restructure debts and avoid liquidation. In 1987, the Agricultural Credit Act provided billions of dollars in assistance to struggling farm lenders. These changes came too late for Anders Sorensen. They came too late for the 13 men who died in his barn. They came too late for the families on both sides who were destroyed by what happened on that October morning. But they came. And in the decades since, when farmers face foreclosure and feel the walls closing in, when the pressure builds to the point where violence seems like the only option, some of them think about what happened in Carroll County. Some of them remember Anders Sorensen and the price he paid. Some of them step back from the edge. Maybe that is worth something. Maybe that is the legacy that Anders Sorensen left behind, not the deaths, but the warning. A reminder that broken systems create broken people. A testament to what happens when desperation has nowhere else to go. Or maybe it means nothing at all. Maybe 13 men died for no reason, and 4 more men lost their lives in prison for no reason, and a family that had worked the same land for 91 years was scattered to the winds for no reason. There are no easy answers, there never were, but the questions remain. What would you do if everything you had built was being taken from you? How far would you go to protect your family, your legacy, your identity? Where is the line between victim and perpetrator when the system itself is the weapon being used against you? Anders Sorensen answered those questions in his own way, on his own terms, in a burning barn on an October morning in 1983. His answers cost 13 lives, destroyed his family, and left a scar on Carroll County that has never fully healed. But the questions did not die with him. They are still being asked by farmers facing foreclosure, by families watching their communities disappear, by anyone who has ever felt the weight of forces beyond their control, pressing down until they cannot breathe. They are being asked right now, somewhere in America, by someone standing at the edge of the same precipice where Anders Sorensen once stood. And someday, somewhere, someone will answer them the same way he did, unless we find a better way. This has been the story of the Iowa Harvest Massacre of 1983. The story of Anders Sorensen and his sons. The story of 13 men who went to do their jobs and never came home. The story of a system that failed everyone, victims and perpetrators alike. It is not a comfortable story. It offers no heroes, no villains, no simple morals. It only offers the truth, as close as we can come to it, of what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond what they can endure. Remember it, learn from it, and hope that we never have to live it again.